Hello again, and welcome back to U.S. History. I'm Mr. Rosenleaf. Before we get underway today, I'm gonna have you turn to your neighbors and discuss a couple things. So I want you to define both yellow journalism and jingoism that we talked about yesterday, and finally answer the question: do you think the USA will gain territory from the Spanish-American War? So remember, yesterday we were talking about the Spanish-American War, and we got pretty much all the way through it, but we didn't really get to finish and see how everything worked out. So take a minute, pause the video, and talk to your neighbor about this as your bell ringer. Great job. I'm sure there were some fabulous discussions going on and some great answers, and you're all ready to talk about this today. All right, so let's do it. So the Spanish-American War ends with the Treaty of Paris, which is yet another Treaty of Paris. Paris seems to be where we negotiate the end of wars from the 1700s through the 1800s into the 1900s. Anytime a war needs to be ended, Paris seems to be the place to do it. I will say that the international language of diplomacy at this time was French. All diplomatic negotiations were done in French. It was sort of the universal language of the time. That will change in World War I. We'll talk about that then. So anyway, December 1898, Treaty of Paris, the Spanish, the Americans. So Cuba will gain its independence. So here are the broad points. You don't need to know the necessarily nitty-gritty. But broad points: Cuba gains independence from Spain. Kinda. This is a kinda thing. We'll see how this works out later. But in all actuality, the U.S. will control Cuba. But Cuba will be independent, and I'm using air quotes there. And the U.S. agrees to pay Spain $20 million for its colonies, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. So all of a sudden, the United States has overseas territories, aside from, we had already taken the Midway Islands at this point. So yeah, that gets set up. Now, this treaty was not universally loved. The Senate was highly conflicted about this. One of the main reasons for that was the annexation of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. They felt that we had never really had territories that were not meant for statehood before. And the government was kind of saying that, oh, well, these territories will never become states, but we had never had that. And so senators were kind of flipping out, going, well, what if they do become states? And what if there's, a Filipino senator or a Puerto Rican senator or something like that? And of course, this was a very racist argument, and there were some really racist speeches on the floor of the Senate. Sometime look a couple of those up. They're really bad. So anyway, there were a lot of senators that were opposed to this. There were also senators that said, this is not what America does. This is not what we're about. Although, we had just conquered the entirety of the North American continent. But they said, this is, this overseas stuff, this is just not what we do. And so they were highly conflicted. This very narrowly passed the Senate. But it passed, and so we picked up some territories, and yeah. So here's kind of what the United States looks like at the end of 1898. So you can see the Philippines. We also had the Marianas Islands, the Carolinas Islands, Samoa, or what's called American Samoa, Puerto Rico. Now, Cuba, again, not actually a part of the United States, but it kind of was, at least functionally. Okay, so the aftermath of this, Philippine rebels will start to clash because the Filipinos were like, hey, this, they, in the lead up to the war, they're like, okay, this will be okay. The Americans are here now, and they threw off their colonial overlords, and that's what we're looking to do. And so they'll support us. They've been through this before, and the Americans go, you're not ready for independence. You need to be overseen by us before you can be ready for independence. And the Filipinos are like, no, we can be independent now, thank you very much. And so 3+ years of fighting happened. 4,000 U.S. soldiers die, 3,000 wounded, 16,000 Filipinos die in this, and 200,000 civilians killed. So 16,000 rebels and 200,000 civilians end up being killed overall over this entire time. The only time the U.S. and the Filipinos really stopped fighting was when Japan invaded, and then they're fighting against the Japanese. And the Philippines would remain a U.S. territory until 1946, until after World War II, at which time then the United States can go, okay, yeah, you can be independent now. But the U.S. kept a naval base in the Philippines for years, like into the 1990s, I think. Maybe the 2000s is when it finally closed up. But there were American sailors in the Philippines for years. Cuba was kept as a protectorate, so the U.S. sort of oversaw it for 3 years, and then it was independent, but again, not really. The Philippines never, or the Cuba was not really independent really until Fidel Castro took over in the 1950s, and that's a topic for later on. Puerto Rico gradually gains more autonomy. It is still a U.S. territory today. There is talk of making it a state. One particular political party would love to make it a state, along with the District of Columbia. The other one is basically saying over their dead bodies. So probably not going to happen, but it's in the air supply. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about Hawaii. So Hawaii becomes part of the United States around this same time, but how does it get there? So this is not involved in the Spanish-American War, really. Now, I think ultimately the after effects of the Spanish-American War make Hawaii far more desirable for the Americans. But so Hawaii was an independent island hanging out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It was ruled by a monarchy, and Americans started coming to Hawaii in the late 1700s. American missionaries trying to convert the native population to Christianity. These were missionaries based out of New England, for crying out loud. And they would literally sail from Boston down around the tip of South America and up to Hawaii. I mean, this was months-long voyage for these missionaries to get there. And after the first group of missionaries were accepted, then there was sort of a flood of missionaries. And throughout the 1800s, everybody from the Catholics to the Mormons sent missionaries to Hawaii to set up shop. And the monarchy allowed that. In fact, the monarchy started, their children started to be educated by the missionaries so that they could read English, and they started reading the Bible, and so they became more and more Christian as things went along. And Americans became more and more important. They started out as their teachers, and then they became more and more important to the government and started running aspects of the government. And pretty soon, by the end of the 1800s, in I don't remember what year, I forgot to put that down, but in the early 1890s, I believe it was, they forced King Kalakaua to sign what was known as the Bayonet Constitution. So they had already started limiting the monarch's power in Hawaii, this group of Americans, basically, who had pledged that they were Hawaiian citizens, that they wanted to serve Hawaii, and they started to limit the monarch's power. And then they forced, in the early 1890s, King Kalakaua to sign what was known as the Bayonet Constitution. They literally went to the king, held a gun to his head, and said, "You're going to sign this thing." And it basically took away 99% of the monarch's power. And in its place, a sort of group, a cabinet of, in fact, entirely white Hawaiians took over. Now, there was still a monarch, and pretty soon King Kalakaua died, and he was replaced by a queen, Queen Liliuokalani. And she sought to restore the power of the monarchy, to repeal that Bayonet Constitution, and restore power to Hawaiians. One of the things that the Bayonet Constitution had done was it had disenfranchised, taken away the right to vote of most native Hawaiians. So the political system was really rigged for the white American imports that had come, immigrants who had come to Hawaii, either as the children of the missionaries, or had actually directly come to Hawaii. And so Queen Liliuokalani sought to restore that, and she had tremendous support amongst the people. And so in, I believe it was 1896, a group led by this guy, Sanford Dole. You might recognize that last name when you go and buy pineapple in the store. Oftentimes it is Dole pineapple, especially if you're buying, the canned stuff. And that's his family. The Dole family got wealthy on growing crops in Hawaii, things like pineapples. So anyway, he and this group took over. They basically had a coup and removed the queen from any kind of power whatsoever. They established what was called the Republic of Hawaii. So Hawaii had been a kingdom, or I don't know what you call a kingdom, led by a queen, a queendom. So now they are a republic, the Republic of Hawaii. And again, no power for the native Hawaiians, entirely run by these mostly, again, children of these missionaries that had come to Hawaii in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Their children now and grandchildren are trying to run things. So what they were really trying to do, though, was they wanted the United States to come in and take them over. And there was gonna be a stumbling block there, because until 1898, most Americans had no concept of America having an overseas empire. It was just not something that was done, aside from, Midway, nobody lived there. So when we took over Midway, which again was later on, Americans like, yeah, fine, nobody really lives there. So this hits Congress. Congress is generally supportive, but the president... Yeah, take the pass. Congress was generally supportive, but the president, Grover Cleveland, at the time said no, he didn't want to do that. Cleveland, as early as it was 1893, I guess, that a lot of this went down. He acknowledged that the U.S. invasion. So literally, Sanford Dole had U.S. Marines land in Hawaii to restore order during his little coup. And basically, they just legitimized him. But Cleveland said, hey, this is not lawful. This is not okay. That this was an illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian government, and that he promised that the Queen would be restored. This was 1893. He said that and then didn't do anything about it. He could have ordered the Marines that were there to restore the Queen. He chose not to do that. So we're going to end up with a new president coming up here. But before we get there, amongst yourselves, please think about and discuss and pause the video. Should the United States annex Hawaii? Why or why not? Should it happen? Not will it happen? I mean, I think we all know that. But should it happen? Go ahead, pause the video, and discuss that. Well done. Those are some great responses, I'm sure. And let's kind of see what happens here. So there does become a new president in 1896. As we already know, his name is Wiliam McKinley, seen again here. Such a handsome fella. But McKinley was a strong supporter of Hawaiian annexation. Now, Congress was kind of going back and forth on this. He signs a treaty of annexation, but in 1897, it doesn't pass the Senate. But then in the midst of the Spanish-American War, they try again, and Congress is more supportive in a time of war. They're going to do what the president wants them to do largely. And so Hawaiian annexation happens in 1898. I will say a number of Native Hawaiians do not recognize that. And they don't even recognize Hawaiian statehood. There are protests frequently in Hawaii saying that they should not be a state, they should not be a U.S. territory, they should be their own independent thing. They don't go anywhere, and America is not giving up Hawaii anytime soon, but that is out there. So McKinley, again, leads us through the Spanish-American War. We've already seen that. And in 1900, he is up for re-election. The problem is that there is a potential challenger to McKinley's renomination, and that is the Spanish-American War hero and now New York governor. So this guy comes back from the Spanish-American War and is almost immediately hurrahed to the nominating convention, where the Republican Party of the state of New York names him their nominee for governor, and he wins in huge fashion. And so Teddy Roosevelt, who was the leader of the Rough Riders, Theodore Roosevelt, now becomes the governor of New York and a national political figure. And so Republicans are a little concerned. They want McKinley as their nominee, at least the conservative Republicans do. And so what they're going to do is they're going to say, well, rather than go through a bruising nominating convention where the delegates have to choose between a war hero and this kind of slightly pudgy late middle-aged guy, let's just put Roosevelt on the ticket as vice president. McKinley is president, Roosevelt is vice president. Now, this represented, there were two factions of the Republican Party. One was the conservative faction led by McKinley, and one was the progressive faction. So both of these guys, huge imperialists. Foreign policy, they were lockstep. Domestic policy, Roosevelt really wanted to kind of change things and make things better and progress, clean up government, clean up society. And McKinley was just not really for that. He was a conservative. He wanted to go slow. That was what conservatives did. So these two factions of the Republican Party were united as McKinley and Roosevelt run together. And the idea was amongst the conservative Republicans, okay, this guy Roosevelt, will put him on the ticket. He'll be vice president. We won't let him do anything. He can show up and break ties in the Senate. That's what he does. And beyond that, we're not going to listen to him. We're not going to pay attention to him. And in 4 years, nobody's going to know who he is anymore because he's vice president. He's meaningless. And we're just going to ignore him, and he'll go away after 4 years. We won't renominate him. McKinley, he could have run for more than 2 terms. But anyway, that was the plan amongst the Republican Party sort of establishment. Oop, wrong button. There we go. And you can see, so they're sitting here, they're looking like they're together, but Roosevelt, literally in the middle of his term as vice president, Roosevelt thinks, I'm going to go to Harvard and go to law school while I'm vice president. There was no problem with that. He wasn't doing anything. They weren't giving him anything to do. His job was going to funerals and breaking ties in the Senate, and there weren't really any ties in the Senate. So, he had to come down once in a blue moon. So he thought, I can go study law in Boston and just have to come down when I need to come down, and that way I'll have a job when I finish being vice president. He didn't think he had necessarily a political future. He was like 41 years old or something like that. And he's already thinking, well, shoot, now I have to come up with something else to do in my life because I don't really have a political future as vice president. Well, best laid plans of mice and men, gang after glee. And McKinley was in Buffalo, New York in 1900, or in 1901, excuse me. He was reelected in 1900. It was September 6, 1901, and McKinley was at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. He was shaking hands outside building an exhibit called the Temple of Music. And so he's shaking hands, nice to meet you, nice to meet you. A guy comes up. This guy's name is Leon Czolgosz. And Czolgosz held out his hand, but there was something in his hand. And there was a handkerchief wrapped around his hand. And he walks up to McKinley and bang, bang, shoots McKinley right in the abdomen. Czolgosz was sort of a dissatisfied immigrant from, I think, Michigan. He had settled in Michigan, and he really felt that McKinley was the source of all of the evil that was sort of keeping him down in the world, and so he goes up and kills McKinley, or he shoots McKinley. Now, McKinley kind of lingers. He's not dead. He doesn't die immediately or anything. In fact, his doctors think he's going to survive. And so Roosevelt immediately rushes to, he's from New York anyway. So he rushes to Buffalo, and McKinley's staff's like, no, get the heck out of here. We don't want people thinking he's going to die. So Roosevelt, you like being outside. Go climb that mountain. And so Roosevelt's like, bully, I'm going to go climb a mountain. And so Roosevelt starts up this mountain, big old mountain. And he starts up the mountain, and McKinley dies. And all of a sudden, Roosevelt's president, but he's partway up a mountain. So they have to send people up the mountain to catch Roosevelt and bring him back down so that he can take the oath of office and become president. So they catch him, he comes back down, he takes the oath of office. Youngest president in American history still to this day. We're not actually improving on that front with our last couple presidents. But Roosevelt becomes president of the United States. Oh, this is a song that I can't play because it's a video. So I will play it for you tomorrow when I'm back in the building and I can play it for you. But Roosevelt becomes president, youngest president in American history, and this is kind of a turning point. Now the Republican Party is going to be, at least for a time, dominated by the progressive wing of the Republican Party. Nowadays we would think that these guys look more like Democrats than Republicans. That's just kind of how politics is. But anyway, that's what happens. So now, in your reflection document, I want you to think about, do you think American imperialism was wise? Is America an imperialist nation today? And do you think Teddy Roosevelt's ascension, or rise, to the presidency will make America more or less imperialist. And why do you think that? So take some time and write that in your reflection document. I'll probably also have another video for you to watch. But there you go. Thank you for staying with me for this, and have a great day. All right, bye-bye.